Hello and a very warm welcome to Money Control. I am Shweta Punj. Prime Minister Modi is in Australia at the moment, and from what we see and from what we hear, he's had a resounding reception in Sydney. Joining us to talk more about the relationship between India and Australia and how this visit by the Prime Minister takes this relationship forward. What does it mean for India and Australia in terms of its economic ties, trade ties, and so on? I'm joined by none other than Professor Salvatore Babones, who's joining us from in front of the Great Hall at the University of Sydney, just a few miles away from where Prime Minister Modi is addressing a packed hall. Professor Babones, we saw your images of your personal meeting with the Prime Minister. Clearly, it seems like Australians are giving a very, very warm welcome to the Indian Prime Minister.
Well, Indian Australians are giving a very warm welcome, and that's the point. There are just so many Indian Australians, something like 750,000. It depends how you count. Probably about 500,000 are either permanent residents or citizens of Australia, so that's a very large potential voting group. And in fact, I've been joking. I wrote an article today joking that this political rally, or not really a political rally, this rally going on, the Welcome Modi event, is in effect the biggest political rally that Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, is attending in Australia. In fact, it's a bigger rally than any politician actually has here in Australia. Any Australian politician actually has here in Australia. So yes, it is a very warm welcome. I want to, let's be honest, it is mainly the Indian diaspora that is focusing on this. All the newspapers have covered it. I'm not sure ordinary Australians who are not of Indian background have much knowledge of what's going on, but certainly the Indian community is crazy over it.
Wow. And how about your meeting with the Prime Minister? Did he compliment you on becoming one of the key global voices on what Hindutva means and on the Indian narrative?
Well, I mean, it was extraordinarily humbling to have the opportunity to meet Mr. Modi for a full quarter of an hour today to discuss India's position in the world. And as you might expect from Mr. Modi, we mainly talked statistics. He was really interested in knowing the numbers, where the numbers came from, where I was getting my numbers from, how India could produce more and higher quality numbers to get its message out into the world. So we had a frank but also very technical discussion, and that's something that those who've read about Mr. Modi and his management style probably won't be surprised by. But I doubt many Western leaders would sit down with a social statistician and have a serious discussion about how numbers are generated and how India could improve its statistical infrastructure. That was really quite an experience.
Fascinating. So that's what he discussed with you, improving India's statistical infrastructure, pardon me. Because there
Absolutely.
has been... That's fascinating. I want to get in your perspective, Professor Babones, on what this visit means for both the countries, because the relationship has not been as pleasant as it is today. It has had its highs and lows. There has been a certain degree of mistrust in the past. This is also Prime Minister Modi's second visit during his term as Prime Minister. So what
Right.
are the two countries hoping for, and what does it mean for both countries and their relationship going forward?
I think any distrust is long past, and that was dispelled by Mr. Modi's visit 9 years ago, when then Prime Minister Tony Abbott really invited Mr. Modi in from the cold. I mean, let's not forget there were real questions in 2014 about what kind of reception Mr. Modi would receive on the world stage. There was real pressure in the United States that Barack Obama should not welcome Narendra Modi to America. Now, there was pressure; it didn't come to pass. But the leader who broke that ice jam, the leader who said, "No, this is a perfectly reputable leader of the world's largest democracy, and he has to be part of the international dialogue," that was Australia's then Prime Minister Tony Abbott. And ever since that moment, India-Australia relations have been incredibly warm, and they've never let up since. Now, we've had the recent trade deal last year that was negotiated under the previous government, the Scott Morrison Liberal Party government. Today, Australia has a Labour Party government. Under Labour, I think there's been some subtle downgrading of the relationship. Now, I say it's very subtle, and I don't want to make too much of it. But unlike India, Western countries send as ambassadors to their top diplomatic partners. They send high-profile politicians, not professional diplomats. Now, India uses professional diplomats all around the world. That's the practice in India. But in Australia and the United States and the United Kingdom, there is this practice of sending high-profile high commissioners and ambassadors. Now, you'll notice that the current high commissioner in India is a former Liberal Party state premier. He's a very serious Australian politician. He is being replaced with a career diplomat. Now, I don't think that's any slighting to India or to Mr. Modi, but it is a contrast to the situation in the United States and the United Kingdom. In both of those countries, the current Labour government has appointed top politicians to represent them. In the case of the United States, none other than Kevin Rudd, the former prime minister. So that is something I think that may lead me to question whether the Australian Labour Party places India on quite the same level as its counterparts, the Liberal Party, did 1 year ago.
Interesting. So, I was reading vandalism of Hindu temples is a big concern. Also, greater focus on building more sustainable supply chains. What are the things that that India is batting for at the moment, and what is important to Australia from this whole dialogue between the two nations?
Well, the dialogue is not really driven by that. From the Australian side, the main interest is in being able to invest in India. There's a lot of appetite in Australia to invest in India, not just among major corporates, but among second-tier companies and investors who are really eager to get into the Indian market. Now, there's always interest in exports, but Australia mainly exports minerals, and minerals from Australia are already going to India. On the Indian side, the chief interest seems to be in people, that is, in getting easier visa access to Australia, easier access to Australia for Indian students. Now, that said, there have been several examples of both temple vandalism and vandalism at consulates here in Australia, Indian consulates in Australia. I know those have been brought up and have been discussed at the highest levels directly with Anthony Albanese here in Australia, the Prime Minister here in Australia. And of course, he's promised to enforce Australian law. But I'm not sure that Indians can take much comfort from that. After all, Australia is a free society. There seems to be an idea in India that Anthony Albanese should just round up all the Khalistanis and put them in prison. And, you don't even do that in India, never mind here in Australia. So, yes, there has been some minor vandalism, some low-level violence. It is a concern, but it's something that nobody in Australian society really supports. Not the newspapers, obviously not the Indian community, but from what I can tell, not the Sikh community here either. This is just a few people who seem intent on causing trouble, but not getting much sympathy for doing so. I think they've been very surprised that instead of being received as freedom fighters in some way, they've been received as the minor hooligans that they are.
Right. But do you see this as one of the top one of the top issues that are going to be discussed, or that has been discussed between the two leaders, because it does come down to a feeling of insecurity amongst the Indian diaspora in Australia. It does come down to just basic freedom.
No, honestly, I don't think so. Look, it's something that pro forma must be discussed. I'm sure that it has been raised, and it'll be raised very quickly. That is, it will be raised in a matter of a 30-second introduction and a 30-second reply. That, of course, Australia will look for the perpetrators, try to ensure that Indian Australians are safe, and then the leaders will move on to more substantive issues. And the reason that it will be discussed in a very cursory way is not because it's unimportant, but because there's no disagreement on it. I mean, nobody supports vandalism, nobody supports violence, but at the same time, both sides realize that Australia is a free society, and vandalism, while regrettable, is not a major crime in Australia any more than it is in India. I mean, the two countries have very similar systems. So I don't expect it to be front and center. In fact, what I expect to be front and center is the security relationship. Narendra Modi gave an interview to Australia's national newspaper, The Australian, yesterday, and he
Yes.
said in his interview with The Australian that he's looking for a deeper bilateral security relationship with Australia. Now, remember, uh, most Australia-India security relations go through the United States, whether that's the Quad, which is quadrilateral effort involving the United States and Japan, or it's joint exercises in the Indian Ocean. They've always, to my knowledge, taken place under a U.S. strategic umbrella. Now, I think
Sure.
Mr. Modi is seeking to establish a direct relationship with Australia. I think that's long past due. Australia and India are the two major Indian Ocean littoral countries that have a meaningful presence in the Indian Ocean to maintain maritime security. And I expect that relationship to be the one they talk most about in their negotiations today and tomorrow.
So I want to talk to you a little bit more about that, the bit about the bilateral security cooperation with Australia. Um, Moving on from here, how do you see that engagement strengthening? And what's the sense that you're getting in terms of the response from the Australian side to this?
I don't know how Australia will respond. Australia, since the change in government a year ago, Australia under Anthony Albanese has been trying to mollify China, trying to get China to eliminate the informal trade sanctions that China has put on Australian exports. And so there's been a softly approach to China. There's a strong feeling here in the Labour Party that the previous Liberal government was too open and aggressive in its condemnation of Chinese aggression. And so there's an effort here to pull back from that, not to be seen as confronting China too directly. Of course, we've seen that in the United States as well, under Joe Biden, not wanting to confront China directly. I'm not sure about Fumio Kishida in Japan, what his situation is, but it was certainly his, two times predecessor, Shinzo Abe, the late Shinzo Abe, who was the real driving force behind Japan's hawkish stance on China. So I think today it really is true that India stands alone against China. I mean, in the same way that the United Kingdom stood alone against Hitler and the Nazis in 1941, India is the only country that is really actively confronting China along a very large front, both in the Himalayas, but also at sea. That is the only country that's having to routinely push back against China is India, and we might say to a lesser extent or in a very different context, Taiwan. But the other countries seem to want to mollify China and return to normalcy, which, for India is not necessarily a good thing.
Mhm. Right. Professor Babones, I want to ask you, after this visit, after this visit by the Prime Minister, you said that there is a lot of interest from Australian businesses to come and invest in India. What
Yes.
are the key sectors that you can sense that there is a lot of interest in, and what would it take for them to come and expand their businesses or set up businesses in India?
Yeah, infrastructure. That's number one. And I'd say financial services is probably number two. And then you get onto specialty areas, very niche businesses of all kinds. But infrastructure and financial services are definitely top of the list, as well as always resources. But natural resources is in a way just an extension of the infrastructure industry. They're very similar in many ways in their needs. So these organizations want to get into India. They see India liberalizing and opening, and that now is the opportunity. I mean, just as people saw in China in the early 2000s, it's not in the early 2000s in China. It wasn't the pathfinders who were getting into China; then they were already there. It was the big mainstream companies that saw the market growing and wanted to be part of it. Well, they're now seeing that in India. This is an inflection point for Western interest in India. Previously, Western companies wanted to put back office operations in India, low cost support in India. Now they're looking at India as a domestic market in itself. That is, they want to produce in India for the Indian market. If Australian resources companies go to India, it won't be to take the minerals from India and send them somewhere else. It will be to produce in India for Indian end use. And that's really been the tipping point just right now that's happening. And the awareness is rising dramatically in Australia. So big Australia is very suddenly interested in India.
Right. So, what is it that's piquing the interest of the Australians to come and invest in India? Is it our population? Is it the opportunity? Is it the changes, the reforms they have seen over the past few years?
Three things: the population, the rapid economic growth, and the increasing unification of India as a single market. So for that, if you look back to GST, for example, the GST reform or demonetization, that it is increasingly, they're not thinking, oh, if we want to get into Karnataka, we'll never be able to use that as a base for selling in Rajasthan. Right? This would have been the old idea of how India works, that you have to have 30 separate India strategies. Now there's the feeling that you can get away with having one India strategy, that India is a single unified economy. And that creates massive economies of scale for any entity wanting to enter the Indian market. So I can't overstate the extent to which Australian investors are keen to get into India. And again, I'm stressing not just the big investors. The big investors are sophisticated enough they could always enter the market. I'm now hearing from a lot of people around town who have never invested in India before, who invest in a panoply of companies or maybe have one medium-sized company, and they're considering, should we be expanding into India? I think it's gratifying. They often ask my opinion, and I have to tell them, I know nothing about India. Go talk to Indians. I just study the democracy. I'm not an expert on money-making opportunities in India. But it tells you something when the investors are coming to a sociologist, a university sociologist, to get an
Right.
opinion on India. They're really interested.
Absolutely. So, I want to ask you. We have elections coming up in less than a year now. Actually, almost
Right.
exactly a year now. If there's a change in government, if the government changes, would the interest remain? Or do you think this is also a vote for Prime Minister Modi's leadership in the country and that's what they're betting on? Or are they betting on India as a country? And the interest is, it's not dependent on whether there is a BJP led government in power or whether there's any other government in power.
Look, this is an India story. This is not a BJP story or a Modi story. People want to be involved in India. Now, those who are more sophisticated understand that Mr. Modi and the BJP have made infrastructure development an absolute top government priority. And so the sophisticated investors are aware that their chances of having a pan-Indian business that they can operate seamlessly throughout the country have been greatly improved by having the infrastructure development we've seen and having the online development, that is the e-commerce development that we've seen, including everything from the Aadhaar numbers to the increasing number of people with bank accounts. All of that has certainly been a positive. But as with everything, I urge Indians to understand, to set aside their politics, that these sort of questions are not about supporting one party or the other. This is really about Westerners being interested in India as such and the robustness of its institutions. If India were a place like Turkey, which had a strongman government, and you might like the strongman, but you're afraid if he falls, that everything would fall apart, nobody would want to invest, right? I think investors are confident that whether the BJP wins or loses, okay, taxes may go up 1%, a certain expressway might or may not get built, but the trajectory is there. And no matter who comes to power in 2024, India is still going to be top of the list for Western companies looking to make investments in the developing world.
So, how will Australia, do this balancing act? You have Australian businesses very interested in investing in India. India has asked for bilateral security cooperation with Australia. So, China is the big elephant in the room. How is Australia going to manage this?
Well, the business development doesn't depend on the government. So the government has its own priorities for its relationship with India, but that's not going to stop the investors. The investors are, in Western countries, well, for that matter, in India and democratic countries around the world, investment doesn't go where a prime minister tells people to invest. Investment goes where the investors think they can make money. And Australian investors are very keen on the India opportunity. Now, of course, the Anthony Albanese government is very keen to promote these kind of ties, but they're much more interested in bringing Indian investment to Australia than in getting Australian investment to India. That said, they've started a new center, so they've poured, I think it's something like 28 million Australian dollars, something about 20 million US dollars, into a new center for Australia-India relations. That's been announced under the previous government. It's been launched this year under the Labour government. So it's a bipartisan initiative here in Australia. And they will be promoting trade and investment, the development of trade and investment ties between Australia and India. And good luck to them. It's certainly a bipartisan, all of country effort. Nobody wants to be left out of that.
Okay, my last question. It's summertime in India, and everyone's planning a holiday. Do you think this visit could yield to easier visa norms for Indians? Is that something that Australia would be willing to look at?
Unfortunately, I doubt it, and I'm sorry to give that bad news. Australia is currently undertaking a root and branch visa reform and reviewing its entire visa system, but the intention of that review is very clearly to create easier and more structured paths to permanent residence and citizenship. It is not to ease up the tourism or even the business travel arrangements. I mean, we saw with the trade agreement there was some very modest improvement in the situation for Indian business travelers coming to Australia. And India gave up reduced tariffs in the trade agreement. Primarily what Australia gave up was more visas for Indians. Well, you can see there's an asymmetry there, right? That Indians are having to effectively pay to get better access just to get visas. Now, Indian business people are not coming to Australia, jumping visa and deciding to, live illegally in Australia. This is just not a problem. Why the Australian government can't see that it's senseless to maintain visa restrictions for Indian business travelers, for Indian tourists, I don't understand. But the fact is, Australia has a very firm policy on this, and a lot of it is driven by the relative wealth of the country they're dealing with, and they still see India as a poor country that they don't want to admit people, or that they want to make it very difficult for people to enter Australia. I think that's probably a short-sighted policy, but then I have to stress, I'm not Australian.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Professor Babones. Enjoy your evening, and we do hope that you get another meeting with Mr. Modi while he's there. And
I
look forward to...
doubt that.
All right. Thank
I
you
got
so
to get 2 meetings with the Prime Minister, but of course he has my number, so he's welcome to look me up.
Well, thank you so much. Have a good night.
Great to talk to you.